Okay, let's dive in. We've got one particular source analysis that landed on our desk, looking at the first few months of a potential second Trump administration and, frankly, how it's gone compared to some expectations.
That's right. The source we're focusing on for this deep dive is an article that really zeroes in on what it sees as the observed and potential impacts of this period. It offers a very specific perspective on how things are unfolding right now.
And our mission for this deep dive is pretty straightforward. We're going to unpack the core arguments,
Yeah.
the specific claims, and, the key insights presented within this particular analysis. Think of this as us being your guides to understanding what this source believes are the most important takeaways from the current situation.
Yeah, and it's absolutely crucial to remember we are exploring this single viewpoint just as it's presented in the source material. We're not adding anything else into the mix here.
Definitely. So the source kicks off right away by noting something, well, interesting.
Oh.
While many observers apparently predicted attacks on democratic norms, institutions, things like that, what seems to have surprised this author was the sheer speed and the extent of the damage being done to what were previously seen as core American strengths.
Right, and the source makes a pretty powerful claim up front. A significant portion of this damage could, in fact, be permanent.
Permanent damage. That's a heavy note to start on. Before detailing those impacts, the source first paints a picture of the America that was, essentially its view of the state of the U.S. just a few months prior, at the end of the previous administration.
Right. So the source characterizes the public mood back then as, well, quite sour, largely focused on that inflation spike that followed the pandemic recovery.
Okay, sour mood.
Yeah, and that feeling wasn't unique to the U.S., apparently. The source mentions similar inflation experiences globally and kind of a global graveyard of incumbents in recent elections.
So there was this dark public mood.
Mm.
But the source argues that if you looked past those bad vibes, there were underlying strengths.
Exactly. Economically, the source points out that for most workers, wages had actually outpaced inflation since the start of the pandemic.
Oh, interesting.
And importantly, it notes that disinflation, meaning prices still rising but slower, was achieved without the high unemployment many economists had feared.
Right, without a deep recession.
Precisely. And taking an even longer view, the source highlights the U.S. economy's strong performance overall in the 21st century. It cites faster productivity and income growth compared to other wealthy nations. The source even quotes The Economist calling the U.S. economy the envy of the world, particularly noting its dominance in advanced technology.
Okay. And what does the source say explains that tech dominance?
It attributes it to a mix of factors like investment, a risk-taking culture, these vibrant high-tech clusters, and also strong science and higher education systems.
Right, the universities, the research base. Okay, so economic strengths, especially in tech, were a key part of the America that was, according to this source. What else does it highlight about that period?
Well, the source claims several non-economic indicators were also positive. Despite narratives about rising crime, it says the post-COVID crime bump had actually receded.
Receded, okay.
Yeah, by 2024, America's homicide rate was reportedly near its lowest in 65 years. It even gives a specific example, New York City, showing a really dramatic drop in murders from 1990 to 2024, based on the data it presents.
Wow, okay, so positive economic and crime trends according to the source.
Yeah.
But it wasn't all rosy, right? I mean, the source acknowledges challenges too.
Absolutely. The source notes that income inequality, while maybe declining slightly during the Biden years, remained extreme, very high. It also highlights the high rates of deaths of despair, from suicide, alcohol, opioids, and it correlates these specifically with low male employment rates and large majorities for Trump in certain areas.
Interesting correlation claim there.
Yeah. And low and lagging life expectancy compared to peer nations is also mentioned as a point where the U.S. performed poorly.
So the source's summary of the starting point is, well, nuanced then. A nation with a dark public mood, but maybe strong underlying performance on many economic and crime fronts, while still grappling with these deep issues like inequality and mortality.
Exactly. And then, according to this source, the new administration moved quickly to shift that picture pretty dramatically.
Precisely. The source then dives into what it calls MAGAnomics and provides a sharp critique. It notes that while many voters might have expected a return to first-term prosperity, most economists reviewing the platform during the 2024 campaign actually gave it poor reviews.
Right. And the source identifies 3 key points from that pre-election analysis that look particularly disturbing to it.
Okay, what were they?
The first was the proposal for large tariff increases, even bigger than those in the first term, which, standard economic theory suggests would cause inflation and reduce real incomes.
Okay, tariffs, number one.
Second, large-scale deportations, seen as highly disruptive to industries reliant on foreign-born workers, think agriculture, construction, stuff like that.
Right, disruptive potential. And the third?
The third disturbing point the source flagged was the clear intention to politicize the Federal Reserve, the institution responsible for fighting recessions and controlling inflation.
Politicizing the Fed. Okay, those are the three big pre-election worries from this source. So what does it say about the status now, a few months in?
Right. The source claims that as of the time of writing, the status of these threats kind of varies. The deportations have been brutal and illegal, the source says, but haven't yet caused a massive worker impact across the whole economy.
Not yet.
And the administration has reportedly raged against the Fed chairman, Jerome Powell, but hasn't yet actually taken control of the institution.
Okay, so 2 out of 3 not fully realized yet, but...
But GT, according to the source, the tariffs are here. And not just here, but, and I'm quoting loosely here, more extreme and, crazier than anything suggested back then. That's a pretty strong claim.
It is. Crazier. How so? Does it give specifics?
It does. And the source backs that up with some numbers from its analysis. It states that America's average tariff rate, which was a fairly free trade-friendly 2.4% when the administration took office, was subjected to huge increases.
Huge increases, okay.
Imports from China, the source says, temporarily faced a 145% tariff. 145%.
Whoa. Temporarily.
Yeah, later provisionally reduced to 30%. But even with that reduction, the source calculates the average tariff rate climbed to 17.4%.
17.4% average. That sounds really high.
It is. The source says it's the highest since 1934, approaching the level after the infamous Smoot-Hawley tariff.
Wow, 1934. That comparison alone tells you something about the scale the source believes is happening here. Why does the source argue this scale means severe damage?
Because it says this isn't just 10% or 25% on a few specific things. It's 10% on everything and 30% on everything from a major supplier like China.
Look at the broadness and the level.
Exactly. The source points to immediate signs it claims indicate damage. West Coast ports reportedly seeing a sharp drop in ships from Asia. It even mentions a report claiming no container ships were departing China for America at that particular moment.
No ships leaving China for the U.S. That sounds drastic.
It does. And what does the source predict happens as a result?
Let me guess. Higher prices.
Soaring prices, potentially empty shelves, widespread layoffs, even bankruptcies among businesses dependent on imports, trucking, retailers, manufacturers.
A pretty bleak outlook.
And adding to that, the source argues, is the immense uncertainty created by the tariff policy itself. It recounts something it calls Liberation Day on April 2nd, when huge tariffs were supposedly imposed globally. Including, and this is a detail the source includes, islands inhabited only by penguins.
Wait, penguins got tariffed? Seriously?
That's the memorable detail the source decided to include, yes. Presumably to make its point about perceived irrationality or lack of careful thought.
I guess that makes the point. What happened after Penguin Liberation Day?
Well, according to the source, those global tariffs were paused just a week later, replaced by a new, equally extreme set. The source claims this happened after 2 cabinet members managed to corner the president while his trade czar was out of the room.
Cornered him. So the source uses that anecdote to underscore the policy's volatility, right? And asks, how can businesses possibly plan in that environment?
Exactly. How do you decide whether to invest in a factory in Mexico or the U.S. if either could become worthless depending on some unpredictable future tariff decision?
Yeah, possible.
The rational response for businesses and consumers, according to the source, becomes inaction. You just accumulate cash rather than investing or spending because you don't know what's coming next.
Makes sense.
The source also points out that these tariffs likely violate existing international trade agreements and are already facing court opposition, which, it argues, just adds another layer of unpredictability, undermining the very purpose of having trade rules in the first place.
Okay, so violation of agreements, court challenges, more uncertainty.
Right. So all of this leads the source to its overall economic consequence claim, a substantial risk of stagflation.
Stagflation, the nasty combo.
Exactly. Rising prices and shortages because tariffs cut off imports, combined with rising unemployment because this erratic policy deters spending and investment.
And the source's conclusion here?
quite direct. It says, all of this chaos is on Trump's head, claiming the economy would likely be doing fine otherwise.
Okay, so that's the economic picture painted by this source. Heavy stuff.
Yeah.
It then shifts focus to what it calls demolishing government, waging war on the poor.
Yeah. The source argues that despite the populist label often used, the administration's fiscal agenda is clearly right-wing in its view. Large tax cuts for the rich and what the source calls savage benefit cuts for the poor and working class.
Savage cuts. Strong language. Does it give examples?
It does. It claims the budget bill that passed the House back in May was incredibly extreme. It points to specific cuts identified in its analysis.
Like what?
Almost $700 billion from Medicaid. That's the federal and state program providing health coverage to millions of low-income Americans.
$700 billion from Medicaid. The impact.
The source argues this could lead to millions, potentially 15 million or even more, losing their health care coverage.
15 million. Wow. What else?
It also claims close to $300 billion cut from SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, food stamps.
Okay, food stamps cut by $300 billion.
Which, the source says, means many Americans will simply go hungry. It references a CBO estimate, that's the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office,
Right.
claiming these cuts alone would reduce the purchasing power of lower-income households by about 4%. Some independent estimates the source saw were even higher.
So less healthcare, less food assistance, less purchasing power.
And then add those tariffs we just talked about. The source says they add to this burden, forcing working families to pay higher prices for essentials like clothing and food.
Right, the tariff impact hits those budgets too.
Combining these factors, the source estimates Americans in the bottom 10–20% of the income distribution could be 7% or more worse off overall, with some suffering even more acutely.
7% worse off for the lowest income groups? That's significant. But despite these cuts targeting lower incomes, the source claims the budget adds to the deficit.
Yeah, that's the claim. Adds $3.8 trillion to the deficit, according to the CBO estimate it cites.
With those big cuts.
And the reason, according to this analysis, tax cuts, primarily at the top.
Tax cuts outweighing the spending cuts, leading to more debt, according to the source and the CBO estimate it uses.
That's the argument. And the source points to market reaction as kind of a validation for this deficit forecast. It claims long-term bond rates have soared and the dollar's value has plunged against foreign currencies.
Implying what?
Suggesting investors are losing faith in U.S. credibility, maybe even its long-term solvency?
Losing faith. Okay, so that's the budget impact. But beyond the budget, the source argues the administration is actively destroying the government's ability to function.
Yes. Actively destroying its ability to carry out basic functions.
And here's where the source brings up Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, right?
Yes, DOGE. The source claims it was obvious from the start that DOGE couldn't deliver the huge savings that were promised.
Why not?
Well, while acknowledging waste exists, the source argues the bulk of government spending is actually on the safety net or the military. And these, Muskenjugend, that's the term the source uses for the young tech employees brought in.
Muskenjugend. Yeah.
They couldn't save significant sums without just creating chaos, according to the source.
And the source claims that chaos is precisely what DOGE delivered.
That's the claim. It alleges DOGE's receipts for savings are a tiny fraction of what was promised, riddled with accounting errors, and that ultimately no overall spending cut is actually visible in the budget data.
So no real savings, just chaos.
But the chaos is visible, according to the source. It mentions stories filtering out about sudden dismissals of crucial, experienced workers, followed by desperate attempts to rehire them or people like them. Agencies the public relies on, like Social Security, are reportedly fraying. The source mentions increasing tales of missed checks, difficulty getting help on the phone or online.
Yeah, you can see how that would directly impact people, especially vulnerable people.
Exactly. And the source argues this goes beyond just monetary loss. It talks about the psychological damage from the uncertainty, the panic, the frustration for people depending on government aid or services.
The human cost.
And the source takes a moment here to sort of defend civil servants. It claims millions are good people who care about their jobs, often working for lower salaries than they could get in the private sector.
Right.
Subjecting them to arbitrary firings and contempt, the source argues, is destroying a really valuable public asset. The institutional knowledge, the dedication.
And here's that claim of permanence again, isn't it?
It is. The source argues much of this damage to the government's functioning could be irreversible. It claims lost civil servants may not return, young people will be deterred from public service careers.
Yeah, why would they?
The government itself is degraded, and it might take decades, the source speculates, to restore what's lost.
Decades. Okay. Moving from government function to knowledge itself. The source presents another stark picture in a section titled The War on Knowledge.
Yeah, this one's pretty dramatic, too. It starts by saying the U.S. was, a world leader in science and intellectual inquiry just a few months ago.
Was, past tense.
Past tense. And it claims the devastation since then has been immense, bringing scientific research in America to a screeching halt. That's a quote.
A screeching halt. That sounds total. How?
It details budget proposal claims for 2026 identified in its analysis. A 40% cut to the National Institutes of Health, the NIH.
40%. Wow, NIH funds so much medical research.
Exactly. And more than half cut from the National Science Foundation, NSF, which supports all that fundamental research and education across non-medical fields.
Over half of NSF gone.
That's the proposal claim cited. But the source's claim is that the support effectively dried up before the next fiscal year even started.
How could that happen? The budgets weren't passed yet.
Well, it says the NSF instructed staff internally to stop awarding all funding actions until further notice. That means no new grants or any further disbursements on existing ones. Just cut off.
Just stop the money flow. And NIH.
And the NIH, the source claims, is essentially ghosting grantees. Not formally canceling projects, maybe, but simply failing to send the funds they were promised.
Ghosting scientists. Wow.
Yeah, but the source argues the war on science isn't just about money, though. That's a big part, but not all of it.
What else then?
It claims there's a push against any research perceived as woke or touching on DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion.
The culture war angle entering science funding.
Exactly. The source gives examples like suppressing climate change evidence or studies on vaccine efficacy. The source calls this whole thing a frontal assault on intellectual inquiry.
A frontal assault. And permanence. Does that come up again here?
Oh, yeah. Once again, the source argues this damage is likely permanent. It asks, who would start a major long-term research project in a nation behaving this way?
Good question.
Or who would come from abroad to study or work at U.S. universities knowing they are potentially one election away from persecution, maybe even arrest?
Persecution or arrest. That's extreme language from the source.
It is. And the source's dramatic conclusion for science is, quote, the American century may well be over, at least in science.
The American century for science, over. That's a sweeping statement about the long-term impact, according to this source. Okay, now one area the source calls a surprising development is the administration's relationship with cryptocurrency. This section is titled Crypto's New Gilded Age.
Surprising? How so? What's surprising about it?
Well, the source frames it by claiming crypto has largely failed, for years, to find a real legitimate economic role. Most legitimate businesses still don't accept it.
Okay, that's a common critique. So what's its real role, according to this source?
Illegitimate business, basically. The source argues it allows untrackable sums to move around, particularly stablecoins like Tether, which it claims are widely used in criminal activity like blackmail and extortion.
Right, the anonymity aspect being used for crime. Not exactly surprising, maybe. So what's the new development the source finds remarkable?
It claims there's an even more remarkable use emerging that ties directly back to the administration.
Oh, which is?
Bribery. The source claims crypto is being used for bribery on a massive scale. Bribery? How?
Specifically citing things like Trump and Melania meme coins being used to transfer billions of dollars to the president and his family, quote, likely in return for influence.
Billions via meme coins as bribes.
Yeah.
That's quite a claim from the source. Does it offer detailed proof in the analysis we have?
It doesn't offer, smoking gun proof in the section we reviewed, but it points to a specific example mentioned elsewhere, apparently a party held for crypto enthusiasts where attendance cost $1 million per person.
$1 million to attend a party?
Yeah. The source presents that as circumstantial evidence of huge amounts of money flowing towards the administration from the crypto world.
Okay. Circumstantial, but suggestive in the source's view.
And the source's overall take on this situation, it says it makes the corruption of the historical Gilded Age look petty and quaint by comparison.
Petty and quaint? Wow. Okay, so given this really stark picture, the source paints massive disruption across the economy, government functions, science. It then turns to what it calls the obvious question. What's the motive? Why is all this happening, according to this analysis?
Right. The why behind it all. Does it offer a theory?
It does. It considers an alternative theory first, one it says is held by many on the left and center left, that this is basically government by and for oligarchs.
Okay, the rule by the rich theory.
Yeah, the idea that billionaires want to get richer, they want to cut the social safety net to pay for their tax cuts, and they want to dismantle government functions so they can privatize them. The source says there's clearly something to that, and that enrichment is likely occurring.
But there's a but coming, isn't there?
There is. The source argues this isn't the whole story. It claims this oligarch explanation doesn't fully account for certain policies.
Like what?
Like the trade war, which the source argues hurts almost everyone, including many businesses, or the destruction of science. Why would oligarchs necessarily want to undermine research that could, say, fight infectious diseases that affect everyone?
Good points. So if oligarch enrichment isn't the full story according to the source, what is its primary theory for the underlying motive?
It calls it the triumph of resentment.
Resentment. Interesting. Based on what?
The source bases this on its observation from reading and watching figures like Trump, Musk, and RFK Jr. It describes them as essentially angry, insecure people.
Angry and insecure despite their power and wealth.
That's the source's take. And it uses a specific example to illustrate this point. It quotes Trump talking about revoking Harvard's tax status. And then asks, does that sound like a rational policymaker weighing pros and cons, or does it sound like someone nursing a grudge?
A grudge against elites, maybe?
Perhaps. Source argues these men aren't suffering from economic anxiety. They're already wealthy, powerful, and likely enriching themselves further. But the source suggests, based on its observations, that anyone who spent time around certain types of privileged men knows how easy it is for some to feel bitter and angry when their privilege doesn't bring them the fulfillment or admiration they expect.
It even draws a parallel to some elite academics, it's known, who might feel similarly slighted despite their status.
That's an interesting, maybe provocative parallel the source draws. So the source claims the common thread connecting these figures is a feeling that they personally have been treated very badly.
Treated badly? How so, according to the source?
Well, it speculates. Trump feeling disrespected may be seen as an ignorant bore despite being president. Musk feeling he no longer gets the universal admiration he once did. RFK Jr. wanting desperately to prove he isn't a crank, and maybe wanting to silence those who contradict him. These are the source's interpretations of their potential resentments.
Okay, so personal slights, perceived disrespect, fueling resentment. And the source connects this resentment directly back to specific policy areas.
Yes, it draws direct lines. The tariffs. Partly to get back at the economists and establishment figures who criticized him. Musk wrecking parts of the government. To prove he's a genius who knows better than the bureaucrats. RFK Jr. involved in destroying medical research. To silence the scientists who contradict his views, according to this source's theory.
So, policy driven by personal pique and resentment in this view.
That's the core argument about motive here. The source concludes this section by stating there's something deeply wrong with a body politic that puts such people in power, driven by such motives.
And the outlook.
The source expresses faith that their reign, as it calls it, will eventually end. But it claims incredible damage is already done and says it doesn't expect a full recovery within its own lifetime.
Wow. A rather pessimistic outlook on the permanence of the damage, then, from the source's perspective.
Very much so. Okay, so let's synthesize this analysis for you, the listener. This specific source paints a picture of a nation potentially facing really significant challenges just months into this new administration.
Yeah, it highlights concerns across multiple areas. You've got an economy potentially facing stagflation and instability due to what it describes as erratic and extreme tariff policy. You've got a government whose fundamental functions are claimed to be degrading rapidly due to budget cuts targeting the poor and what it calls administrative chaos, like with that DOGE example.
Right.
A scientific and intellectual community allegedly facing a frontal assault and brought to a screeching halt. And the rise of what the source describes as crypto exploitation, possibly bordering on historical levels of corruption and bribery.
And underpinning all of this, the source argues that beyond any specific policy goals, a key driving force might be this pervasive sense of resentment among key figures in power.
That's the theory it puts forward.
So, as you consider this specific analysis, just this one source's take, here's a question maybe for you to think about. How do the specific claims made by this source about things like potential disruptions to government services or economic instability from unpredictable trade policy, How might those things potentially affect you or communities that you know?
Yeah. How does it connect to the real world as you see it?
We've just taken a deep dive into one particular analysis that explores what it sees as significant changes and challenges unfolding right now.
And just to reiterate one last time, this deep dive focused solely on understanding the points raised within this single source material. We presented its perspective as it was written.
Exactly. And as we wrap up, maybe consider the source's argument about resentment as a powerful driving force behind major policy shifts. And then perhaps sit with its claim that some of the consequences it describes might be truly long-lasting or even irreversible. It's certainly a provocative thought to mull over based on this one analysis.